They say good fences make good neighbors, but what happens when the person living next door isn't quite what they seem? When the walls between your home and theirs become paper thin, and the secrets they're hiding start to seep through. Tonight, I'm sharing 3 deeply disturbing tales of neighbors who are hiding something far more sinister than anyone could have imagined. Stories that will make you question everyone living on your street. So lock your doors, check your windows, and whatever you do, don't make eye contact with the person next door. When Marcus inherited his grandmother's old Victorian house in Portland, he thought his luck had finally turned around. The mortgage was paid off, the neighborhood was quiet, and best of all, there was a basement apartment that could provide rental income. He'd never been a landlord before, but how hard could it be? The first tenant who responded to his ad seemed perfect. Daniel was quiet, polite, always paid rent on time and kept to himself. He worked night shifts at a warehouse, so Marcus rarely saw him. The perfect tenant, really. Daniel had only 2 requests. He wanted blackout curtains installed in the basement windows, and he asked that Marcus never, under no circumstances, enter the basement apartment without at least 24 hours' notice. Marcus agreed. Privacy was important, and besides, he had no reason to go down there anyway. The basement had its own separate entrance around the side of the house. For the first 6 months, everything was peaceful. Daniel was a ghost. Marcus would occasionally hear footsteps late at night, the muffled sound of movement below, but nothing concerning. Then, the smell started. It began subtly, a faint odor that Marcus first noticed near the heating vents. Something organic, decay-like, but not quite. He checked for dead mice, cleaned the vents, even had an exterminator come through. Nothing. The smell persisted, growing stronger as weeks passed. It was worst at night, seeping up through the floorboards of his kitchen, making him gag when he opened the refrigerator. Marcus texted Daniel about it, asking if he'd noticed anything strange in the basement. Daniel replied immediately, just some old pipes, nothing to worry about, he'd take care of it. But the smell didn't go away, it got worse. 3 weeks later, Marcus was woken at 2 in the morning by a sound he'd never forget. A dragging noise, heavy and rhythmic, coming from directly beneath his bedroom. Scrape, pause, scrape, pause. It went on for nearly an hour before stopping abruptly. Marcus lay awake until dawn, his heart hammering, trying to convince himself it was nothing. Maybe Daniel was rearranging furniture. Maybe he was cleaning. Maybe. The next morning, Marcus noticed something that made his blood run cold. There were dark stains on the driveway leading to the basement entrance. They looked like oil at first glance, but when Marcus knelt down to inspect them, the smell hit him. That smell, the same one that had been plaguing his house for weeks, and it was coming from whatever had been dragged out of the basement in the middle of the night. Marcus called Daniel. No answer. He texted. Nothing. For 3 days, he heard no sounds from below, no responses to his messages. The smell, however, remained. On the 4th day, Marcus made a decision that would change everything. He was going down there. The basement door was unlocked. As Marcus descended the stairs, the smell became overwhelming, a physical presence that made his eyes water. The apartment was dark, the blackout curtains drawn tight. Marcus fumbled for a light switch and found it. What he saw in that moment would haunt him forever. The apartment was empty. No furniture, no belongings, nothing except the walls. And those walls, every single one of them, were covered in photographs. Hundreds of them, thousands maybe. All of Marcus. Marcus sleeping in his bed. Marcus eating breakfast. Marcus in the shower. Marcus on his phone. Every moment of the past 6 months documented in meticulous detail. The photos were organized chronologically, creating a timeline of his life that Daniel had been watching, recording, studying. But that wasn't the worst part. In the far corner of the room, Marcus found the source of the smell. A large freezer, unplugged, its door slightly ajar. Inside were plastic bags, carefully labeled with dates and times. And inside those bags were things Marcus recognized. His hairbrush, his toothbrush, his clothes from the laundry, but also other things, organic things, things that had once been alive.
Marcus ran. He called the police from his car, hands shaking so badly he could barely dial. When they searched the basement, they found that the freezer contained remains, not human, thankfully, but animal. Dozens of animals, cats, dogs, raccoons, all at various stages of decomposition, and every single one of them had been surgically altered in some way. An experiment, the forensics team would later conclude. Daniel had been practicing. They never found Daniel. He vanished completely, like he'd never existed at all. But Marcus found something else when he finally worked up the courage to return to his house. A note slipped under his front door, written in precise handwriting. "Thank you for your hospitality. I've learned so much. I'll be watching my new neighbor soon. He looks just like you." Marcus sold the house 2 weeks later at a significant loss. He now lives in a 5th-floor apartment with security cameras and triple locks. But sometimes, late at night, he still wakes up convinced he can hear that dragging sound beneath him. And he wonders if Daniel ever found that new neighbor. If, somewhere, right now, someone else is smelling that same terrible smell and ignoring it, just like he did.
Sarah and Tom bought their first house in a quiet suburb of Milwaukee. The neighborhood was perfect. Tree-lined streets, good schools nearby, and friendly neighbors on all sides. Well, mostly friendly. The woman next door, Mrs. Caldwell, was somewhat of an enigma. She was elderly, perhaps in her 70s, and Sarah only saw her a handful of times in the first few months. Always in the same floral dress, always standing perfectly still in her backyard, staring at nothing in particular. Tom joked that she was like a garden statue. Sarah thought it was sad. Loneliness did strange things to people. She decided to be a good neighbor and baked cookies as a welcoming gift. When she knocked on Mrs. Caldwell's door, there was no answer. She tried again the next day and the day after that. The lights in the house were always on, and sometimes Sarah could see movement through the curtains, but Mrs. Caldwell never came to the door. Then Sarah started noticing a pattern. Mrs. Caldwell appeared in her backyard at exactly 7:43 every evening. She would stand in the same spot, wearing the same dress for exactly 12 minutes, then turn and walk back inside. Every single night, without fail. Sarah found it odd but charming in a way. Maybe it was the old woman's routine, her way of maintaining structure in her life. The real strangeness began when Sarah noticed that Mrs. Caldwell never seemed to age, not a single day older over the course of a year. Same dress, same posture, same blank expression. No gray roots growing in, no change in her gait or appearance. It was as if time had stopped for her. Sarah mentioned it to Tom, who shrugged it off. Old people just looked old, he said. How would you notice them aging? But Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. She started paying closer attention. She noticed that Mrs. Caldwell's newspaper was never collected from the driveway, that mail piled up in her mailbox for weeks before mysteriously disappearing, that the same lights were on in the house at all hours, day and night, as if someone had simply flipped all the switches and left them. One evening, when Mrs. Caldwell appeared for her nightly 12-minute ritual, Sarah decided to approach her. She walked over to the fence separating their properties and called out a greeting. Mrs. Caldwell didn't respond, didn't even turn her head. Sarah called out again, louder this time. Nothing. It was as if the woman couldn't hear her, or worse, as if she wasn't really there at all. That night, Sarah had a dream. She was standing in Mrs. Caldwell's backyard, and the old woman was right in front of her, close enough to touch. But when Sarah looked into her eyes, they were completely empty, not vacant or unfocused, but literally empty, like looking into a void. And Mrs. Caldwell spoke, her mouth moving, but the voice coming from somewhere else, somewhere far away. "I never left. I can't leave. Help me." Sarah woke up gasping. It was 3 in the morning, and through her bedroom window, she could see Mrs. Caldwell standing in her usual spot in the backyard, even though it wasn't 7:43. The old woman was looking directly at Sarah's window, staring with those empty eyes from the dream. The next day, Sarah did some research. She went to the county records office and looked up the property history of Mrs. Caldwell's house. What she found made her skin crawl. Mrs. Caldwell had died 3 years ago.
Heart attack right there in her backyard. The house had been inherited by a nephew who lived overseas and had never bothered to visit or sell it. According to the records, the house should have been empty all this time. But it wasn't empty. Someone or something was in there. Someone who looked exactly like Mrs. Caldwell had looked the day she died. Someone who performed the same 12-minute ritual every evening at the exact time of her death. Someone who never aged, never changed, never broke the pattern. Sarah convinced Tom to call the police for a welfare check. When the officers arrived and knocked on the door, there was no answer. They looked through the windows and reported that the house appeared lived in, but unoccupied. They couldn't enter without cause. As they were leaving, 7:43 arrived, and Mrs. Caldwell appeared in the backyard. The officers saw her. They radioed for backup and went around to make contact. But when they entered the backyard, she was gone, vanished in the seconds it took them to circle the house. They searched everywhere. The back door was locked from the inside. The windows were sealed shut. There was no way she could have gotten back into the house, yet she was nowhere to be found. One of the officers, a veteran with 20 years on the force, told Sarah something that chilled her to the bone. "Ma'am, I've seen a lot of strange things in my career, but I've never seen anything like this. That woman wasn't running from us. She couldn't run from us. I don't think she can leave that spot." Sarah and Tom moved out 6 months later. Before they left, Sarah learned from another longtime resident of the street that Mrs. Caldwell had been a recluse in life. She'd spent her final years alone, refusing help from anyone, convinced that if she maintained her routine, if she never changed, time would somehow stop and she wouldn't have to die. The neighbor said Mrs. Caldwell's greatest fear was leaving her home, being taken away to a nursing facility or hospital. She'd vowed she would never leave, that she'd die in that backyard if she had to. And apparently she did, and apparently she kept her vow. The new owners of Sarah's old house called her 6 months after she moved out. They wanted to know if she'd ever noticed anything strange about the woman next door. They said she appears every night at 7:43, stands for exactly 12 minutes, and vanishes. They wanted to know if Sarah had any advice. Sarah told them the same thing Tom told her when they first moved in. Don't look. Just don't look. Some neighbors are better left alone.
Kevin lived in a duplex in Austin, one of those old converted houses where two families lived separated by a single wall. The wall was thin enough that Kevin could sometimes hear his neighbor, a man named Robert, moving around on the other side. Normal sounds, footsteps, doors closing, water running, nothing unusual. Except Kevin started to notice that the sounds were mirroring his own. When he walked to his kitchen, he'd hear footsteps on the other side, walking to Robert's kitchen at the exact same moment. When he turned on his shower, he'd hear Robert's shower turn on simultaneously. When he closed his bedroom door at night, he'd hear Robert's door close at the same instant. It was eerie, but Kevin chalked it up to coincidence. They were living in identical spaces, following similar routines. Made sense they'd sync up sometimes. But it wasn't sometimes, it was every time. Every single movement Kevin made was echoed perfectly on the other side of the wall. After a few weeks, Kevin decided to test it. He walked to his kitchen at 2 in the morning, a time he never normally went there. The footsteps followed. He stopped. They stopped. He walked backward. They walked backward. Whatever was on the other side wasn't following a routine. It was copying him, instantly, perfectly. Kevin knocked on the wall. 3 quick raps. Immediately, 3 raps came back from the other side. He tried a pattern. Knock, pause, knock, pause, knock. The pattern was repeated exactly. Kevin felt his mouth go dry. He hadn't seen Robert in weeks, hadn't heard him leave or enter his side of the duplex. The only sounds he ever heard were these mirrored ones. He went outside and knocked on Robert's door. No answer. He knocked again, harder, nothing. He tried the doorknob and it turned easily. The door swung open into darkness. Kevin called out Robert's name as he stepped inside. The layout was identical to his own apartment, but that's where the similarities ended. The space was completely empty. No furniture, no belongings, nothing. Just bare walls and floors. And the air was wrong. Too still, too cold, like stepping into a refrigerator. Kevin walked through the empty apartment, his footsteps echoing. As he walked, he heard other footsteps in his own apartment, the one he'd just left. Someone was in there. Someone was following his path, room by room, step by step, but on the opposite side. Kevin turned and ran back to his own door. It was locked. He pounded on it, screaming for whoever was inside to open it. The pounding came back at him from inside, the exact same rhythm, the exact same desperation. Kevin used his key and threw the door open. His apartment was empty, no one there, but every light he'd turned off was now on. Every door he'd closed was now open, and in the center of his living room floor, written in what looked like frost, were 2 words: "Thank you." Kevin didn't stay to pack. He grabbed his keys and left. He later learned from the landlord that Robert had been missing for 3 months. His family had filed a missing person report, but there were no leads. The police had checked his apartment and found it empty, abandoned. When Kevin asked if they'd noticed anything unusual, the landlord gave him a strange look and said that several previous tenants on Kevin's side had left suddenly, all of them complaining about strange noises from the other side. One had even claimed that the apartment next door was trying to learn them, copying everything they did. The landlord didn't believe it, of course. Old buildings made strange noises. People heard what they wanted to hear. But Kevin knew better. Something in that empty apartment had been watching him, studying him, mimicking his every move, and the thank you message suggested it had gotten what it needed. It had learned enough. Kevin later discovered that the duplex had been the site of a murder-suicide 40 years ago. A man had killed his wife on one side of the duplex, then crossed to his own side and taken his own life. The story goes that he'd become obsessed with copying her routine, following her every movement, convinced that if he could perfectly mirror her life, he could somehow become her, escape his own identity. The locals called it synchrony madness. Kevin never found out what happened to Robert, but sometimes late at night in his new apartment across town, he'll hear a sound, a footstep, a door closing, and for just a moment, he'll wonder if whatever was in that empty apartment is still out there, still learning, still copying, still trying to become someone else. And he wonders if maybe, just maybe, it succeeded with Robert. If Robert is now the one trapped in that empty space, mimicking the next tenant, forever synchronized with someone else's life.
So there you have it. 3 neighbors who weren't quite what they seemed. 3 stories that remind us that the scariest things aren't always far away. Sometimes they're right next door, separated from us by nothing more than a wall, a fence, or a few feet of grass. The next time you hear a strange noise from the house beside yours, or notice your neighbor acting just a little bit off, remember these stories, and maybe, just maybe, think twice before investigating. Because some doors are better left closed, some questions are better left unasked, and some neighbors are better left alone. Sweet dreams.